Okay, right, here we are. Hello, I'm Finn Locustain, the founder of the Food and Global Security Network, and I'm also the Chief Executive of Farmwell and the host of the Farmgate podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today. Our new report, Soil Health, a Security Threat Profile, will be available after this launch at www.foodandsecurity.net. The report describes the importance of soil health through the writings of 22 experts, military minds, NGO leaders, scientists, as well as practical farmers. And it also includes 30 recommendations, including 7 key recommendations for governments and policymakers. Now, as we approach COP26 in Glasgow, we believe that this report is essential reading. The right to affordable nutrition underpins peace and civil stability, but the impacts of climate disruption and biodiversity loss are already affecting agriculture. So a 2-degree rise in temperatures, which seems increasingly likely, could lead to extreme disruption in global food production and distribution. When food is scarce, prices rise, inequality increases, and simmering undercurrents can turn rapidly into conflict or even to war. Healthy soil and a balanced ecosystem are critical for food sovereignty and for a peaceful society. And to rebalance nature, it's critical that our urgent efforts to combat climate change do not further limit, damage, or destroy the health and functionality of our soil habitats. The carbon benefits, for example, of mass tree planting must be balanced against the impacts on soil health and broader biodiversity, functioning hydrology, and the capacity for people to grow nutritious and land-appropriate food. And as we say in the report, nature is diverse and interconnected, and so our responses to ecological threats and opportunities also must be diverse and interconnected. We need to deliver multiple outcomes from as much land as possible, rather than sparing or zoning different sections of land for different functions. And at the Food and Global Security Network, we see agroecology with regeneratively managed livestock integrated within rotations as a low risk and low cost solution that can produce great food both locally and at scale, while greatly accelerating carbon drawdown, regenerating biodiversity, and managing precipitation to provide greater drought resilience and better flood protection. Well, hopefully that's given you some sense of what we're about. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our panel of experts. The discussion is expected to last for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then at the end, there should be some time for audience questions if you have any. We're using the chat bar to try and collate those questions, so if you have them, please just type them in. So to this afternoon, I'm joined by 4 fantastic panelists who are each really important contributors to the Food and Global Security Network and also to our report. Rear Admiral Neil Morissetti was the UK's Climate and Energy Security Envoy. Chantal Clément is the Deputy Director of IPES Food based in Brussels. Jimmy Woodrow is the Executive Director of Pasture for Life and the Pasture Fed Livestock Association in the UK. And Reginaldo Haslit Marroquin is the President of the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance based in Minnesota, USA. And he's also the author of In the Shadow of the Green Man, My Journey from Poverty and Hunger to Food Security and Hope. Well, that's our panel. I'll start, if I may, with Rear Admiral Neil Morissetti, if I could come to you first. People talk about ecological breakdown acting as a threat multiplier. And I wonder if you could explain how climate change and biodiversity loss accelerate instability and potentially lead to conflict.
Yeah, Finno, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to join you today. There are many factors that contribute to instability and the risk of conflict, both locally and globally. It's rarely one single cause that you can point to. Some of them fall into what I would describe as a traditional threats bracket, and that might include state-on-state or interstate, intrastate conflict. Examples perhaps that we look at today are activity in the China Seas, resurgent Russia, Eastern Mediterranean, and other areas. But increasingly, we're seeing the impact of what I would describe as non-traditional threats that often don't have a military component. The pandemic we've just been living through is an example of that. And climate change in particular we are seeing is impacting. And it impacts differently from others because it's other drivers of instability, because it impacts right across society simultaneously. And it pushes natural systems outside their historic ranges, stresses the existing management systems in the process or management regimes, both at the local and the national level. Regimes that are only sort of geared to cope with limited climate fluctuations and what it means, whether it be for agriculture, or whether it be for urban living or whatever. But whether it be the onset of long-term trends, rising temperatures, or extreme weather events, we're seeing evidence where climate change is impacting on secure and affordable supplies of food. Now, food along with water and energy are key for our prosperity and well-being, and we need to ensure those supplies are available. It could be because the temperature rises, reducing yields. I think 1 degree centigrade overnight takes 10% off a rice crop. It could be from rising sea levels, saltwater in the aquifers. We've seen that in Asia. It could just be the extreme weather events that destroy crops or flood areas. And it's particularly bad if the quality of the soil and the biodiversity is poor, because that just makes the problem even greater. And once you start to have a lack of food, or the price of that food starts to increase beyond the means of people, you start to have tension, particularly at the time when the world population is still growing. And many of that population have increasing aspirations, including for what they can eat. And at that point, you start to see this as a factor that comes into play in instability, and you start to see people moving around or trying to find food elsewhere, or you see trapped populations who cannot feed themselves, perhaps because they can't afford the food that's available, and then becomes susceptible to being recruited into organised crime or non-state actors like Boko Haram or AQ or Al-Shabaab.
I wonder if you're able to, I mean, thank you very much for that. It's really interesting. I wonder if you're able to point towards any existing examples of conflicts, either current or immediate past, where climate change and its impact on food security have already become critical accelerating factors.
Yeah, as I said earlier, it's unlikely that you're going to get a climate war, and that disappoints many, I know, who'd like a headline of that effect. But if you look at, for example, the Arab Spring, one, and I emphasize, one of the factors that contributed to the riots in markets in Tunis was the price of bread. That bread had gone up because the previous year we'd seen a heat wave in Russia, which meant that their wheat crop was lower, so they exported less wheat, they kept more in the country, that pushed the price up. Simultaneously, we'd seen extreme wet weather in Canada and Australia, which damaged those crops, which brought it together, recognizing this as a global commodity. Another example, prolonged drought in Syria in the first decade of this century resulted in many of the agrarian populations and rural populations moving to urban areas, putting pressure on those societies, exacerbating existing tensions that already existed between some of those communities. And that was a contributing factor. But looking ahead, we're seeing all the signs of this in the Sahel, we're seeing it in parts of Asia. There's a growing risk that, and particularly in the areas where we've damaged the soil and yields are low, that we are not going to be able to support people, and therefore we're starting to see those tensions.
It's interesting that you mentioned Syria. Just coincidentally, at the end of last week, there was a theatre troupe that came around locally that was Syrian exiles, and the whole theme of it was bread. So they actually, they produced bread, they made bread as part of that production, because for them, having been part of that conflict in Syria, for them, bread and the cost of bread, the price of bread, that accelerating factor there was such a critical element of it. So it's really interesting to hear what you're saying about the way in which this sort of thing acts on top of other stresses that already exist, rather than having a climate war or a biodiversity war. What you're having is a number of different steps that just build to the point at which conflict can almost do nothing else but break out. Jimmy Woodrow from Pasture for Life, although this discussion and our report is about the impact of soil health on individual and national security, underlying this is a notion that food security is essential as we face potential ecological breakdown. And I wonder if you could help us out and explain what you think food security means.
Thanks, Finlo, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Well, food security, as I see it currently defined, is simply the proportion of food produced domestically, meaning within any given nation state. Typically, I think this would account for the ability of such a state to control its means of production. And in reality, from where I'm coming from, it's just a statistic. And I think as a result, it kind of lacks meaning. And this is part of what's holding the concept back. Food is seamlessly traded across borders, and governments have had little reason really to pay huge attention to it, and they think the market's going to sort it out. I think we need a new definition that speaks to the situation we're currently in. I think it needs to include elements of nutrition and social justice. The fundamental right of citizens to have access to nutritious food could be one way of looking at it. And most importantly, I think it needs to be taken seriously by policymakers. What this means is it, in my view, needs to be ranked as a threat alongside other national security threats, like climate change now is, though I would probably argue that on climate, it has come a bit late. There is a reason why I think food security is so critically important for agroecology and ultimately soil health. And I think for those of us involved in this world, in this sector, we're arguing for a holistic, rounded solution. But we're often making the case to people in government, particularly, who are stuck in silos, and these sorts of solutions struggle to cut through. If we did succeed in elevating food security as a proper concept, a real security threat, I think we would find it easier to engage with the government and policymakers. If you're looking at food security in the round, as for example, the recent National Food Strategy in the UK did, a planetary health, animal health and public health issue, I think that is the full kind of breadth of the food security issue. I think you would have to, if it was given credence, come up with some holistic solutions. And I think we would ultimately therefore be talking the same language. And I think that's going to be important going forwards. I think there are also, picking up on what Neil was saying, some parallels between the delay in why climate change was not accepted as a security threat for such a long time and what is now happening with food security. I think for a long time, there was a lack of accepted causation between climate change and existential threat because of how elongated the threat multipliers were. And I think this is similar to the disagreement over what food security means, what it's comprised of, and basically how can we take it seriously if we don't really know what it is. I think Neil has explained this well in his previous answer. I think secondly, securitizing a political issue can seem an overreaction, and governments are understandably cautious about doing this. And I think we have a bit of work to do here to make the case for the link between things like soil health and public health to ratchet up the pressure for some serious solutions. And finally, I think that in the way that there's been no clear owner of the global climate issue, with multilateralism arguably, in my view, failing us over the years, there is also no clear owner in the UK government, for example, on food security. It cuts across departments, whether it's DEFRA, health, trade and industry, and others. And I think we need government focus on this, like we saw during Brexit, with a, potentially even a new department with a specific focus.
Thanks very much, Jimmy. I'm interested in what you said about moving from the concept of food security to the idea of nutritional security. And I guess within that, there's a refocusing away from calories and towards diversity of diet, isn't there? And indeed within that, where you started from, what's produced in a given country, a greater diversity of crops and livestock and various different foodstuffs that are grown within each individual nation. That's really interesting. Thank you. Reginaldo Hazlitt-Marroquin from the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance. Now, you grew up in Guatemala during the revolution and the civil war that claimed 200,000 lives. And food security, or rather a lack of it, was a day-to-day reality for you and your family. So I wonder if you could talk to us about what food security means to you.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. And thanks to everyone who came to this conversation. Yeah, very different set of conditions. And yes, my definition of food security, or the sense of food security, is a bit more radical in the context that for us, food security really meant having the community infrastructure, the relationship with the land, and the relationship among all of the different components in the communities, so that food could be produced and delivered and made accessible to everyone, so that everyone could have, well, in some cases, at least one meal, or if we had enough, 2 meals. And for us, that relationship with the land was central to the food security, because we were part of I would say we lived through probably 100 years of history within a decade, because we were able to see, born in extreme poverty with no electricity, nothing really that we know of in the modern world, all the way through, starting to see electrical cables coming through. But in the context of that movement of things, food was the only constant that we could never take our eyes off. Even without electricity and with everything else, our stability and our security as a community and our ability to have conversations about difficult things, for example, was completely determined by whether we had access to food or not. As you know, a 2% dehydration can cause a significant level of irritation, of incapacity, mental processing capacity, and all of that. And if you think of what it means to be food secure, is a lot. And so for us, just having that infrastructure that guaranteed a predictable, consistent access to a meal or 2 or 3 a day was fundamentally our definition of what it meant. And to the extent that we could achieve that, we felt more secure. Now, to the extent that the system started to remove that community infrastructure and started to bring food from the outside farther and farther and farther, then the food insecurity and the sense of insecurity increased further and further. And also the nutritional quality of that food that was accessible in the first place also deteriorated to the extent that, and now with the statistics that we have access to, and the research, especially from the United States Department of Agriculture, we can now verify that the true insecurity came from removing that infrastructure, even though we had more access to fill, as we call it. In real numbers, it is said that you need up to 7 or 8 times, from 6 to 8 times, depending on what product you're looking at, more volume of intake to get to the same level of nutritional levels that you would have achieved in conditions as the ones that we develop in our communities. So technically, our food in the community was 7 times or 6 times, or whichever way you're looking at it, more nutrition and more food security driven than all of this amount of fill that we get from all over the place. And then comes the disruption and the capacity that we have to disrupt the ecology with that large scale industrial impact. And so as a result of that, also the supply chain is directly impacted by that. And that results in further food insecurity. So for us, it was simply having that infrastructure under the control of the communities. And yes, I will say that beyond that, communities working as regions, and then regions working as countries. And that's how you achieve that complete sense of food security the way we see it.
Thanks so much, Reggie. And I'm really interested by something that you said early on there, which was about having to move almost 100 years worth of change in the space of a decade. And as we look forward, there's a degree to which that's what we need to do now, isn't there? Where we haven't got time to wait for humanity to evolve to deal with these crises. We need to somehow speed up that evolution, and ideally before the world sort of piles into crisis in the way that Guatemala did. So thanks so much for that. Chantal Clement from IPES Food, do you think that society's understanding of food security has changed or started to change at global level over the last few decades? Jimmy talked about where food security conversations generally started from and where they needed to be. Reggie gave us that, sort of very personal experience of what food security meant and what it could mean for people. And I wonder if you could sort of talk about whether things have changed at a global level, and if they haven't, the degree to which they need to change.
Sure, thanks, and hi everyone. I think the previous answers, as you just said, really all touched on something crucial, but I like to think that it has changed, at least in definition. And that's really largely due to the influence of civil society, really, and some foundational thinkers in the 1990s. And in the international sphere, at least, we've been relying on this definition of food security adopted by the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, I think from 1996, which itself was a negotiation and was far more multidimensional than the first official definitions developed back in the 70s. And probably without getting too academic, I think we can see the influence of a broader variety of actors of civil society on our understanding of food security, just by looking at the evolution of that international definition over the past decades. I think, as you mentioned earlier, we know that food security is now understood beyond production issues by many, maybe not most, but many, and that it's also about access, cultural appropriateness, and really about understanding individual, household, community vulnerabilities to food access. But I think what's also been really crucial is to see how these massive productivity increases of the 70s and 80s brought about by Green Revolution style practices didn't automatically eradicate hunger. They didn't get rid of malnutrition. They didn't get rid of poverty. And on the contrary, I think this type of agriculture managed to produce more food in terms of volume. But we could also argue that it's exacerbated existing inequalities. It's we all are familiar with the devastating socioeconomic impacts, environmental impacts of these types of practices. So as Jimmy said, what's really needed now is for this broader definition of food security that was mentioned to be better accounted for in policymaking, including nutrition, including protection of natural resources, including these sustainability goals into how we understand food security, because these are all part of the same puzzle. And I think, as Reggie was kind of mentioning, that's also why many of us are talking about food sovereignty instead. Because while food security is defined on paper as this more complex concept, we know that political action, corporate action still really tends to rely on these simple causalities, simple solutions to set their targets and policies. And unfortunately, that still translates into the adoption of often somewhat simplistic policy measures, or strategies that don't necessarily account for the interconnectedness you were talking about in the beginning. This brings us back to prioritizing productivity first, relying on dated narratives of, how are we going to feed 9 billion people? We know what the issues are. I've actually heard it really usefully described once that food security is a goal, but food sovereignty is the way to get there. And I think that's a really useful way of understanding it, because, as was just mentioned, a concept like food sovereignty is rooted in what communities need. It highlights power imbalances in the food systems, these ones that are perpetuating vulnerabilities. It exposes that talking about food security in this narrow sense really keeps us rooted in the practices that we're perpetuating now that haven't particularly been working in this multidimensional way. And food sovereignty, and we can explore that later alongside agroecology, really allows us to think creatively beyond what we're doing now and about what food systems could and should actually look like.
It's interesting to hear what you're saying there. I'm getting a sense that food sovereignty is much more, there are global challenges, global problems that we have, and the food system over the course of the last 50 years has become increasingly global, but actually the solutions that we're looking for need to be much more community centric. And those community solutions will not just be about food production, but also about the distribution of food and how people access food. And that's where that sort of food sovereignty comes down to a community level. And whether that's a localized, a village, a region, or a nation, that's quite a change potentially from what we've been seeing over the last few decades. Jimmy, just moving on from the issue of food security, you talk in your article for the report about pasture and its underlying soil being a strategic asset. And I wonder if you could explain for us a little bit about why soil in particular is so important, why you think it is a strategic asset.
I feel like I just want to quickly pick up one thing that we've been talking about around food security, if I may. And I can't help listening to everyone who's talked on that subject just now. A lot of it comes down to language, doesn't it? And I think a lot of it is around the language of power. And I think Reggie actually talks about this in his article, the kind of need to decolonize ourselves and ensure that we're not just dancing to the tune of power. And we approach this in a new way. But moving on to soil, the big issue of soil, I think ultimately from soil comes life. I think humanity couldn't survive without soil, and the critical role it plays in delivering minerals and nutrients found in the earth to plants and animals that we also eat in one form or another. I think all plants and animals need these minerals for growth and health, and Reggie writes very eloquently on this subject through the lens of energy transformation, which is something I hadn't really kind of thought about before, but I think we talk about it in terms of nutrients, perhaps. I think, unfortunately, the mechanics of how we grow food at scale through cultivation and the increasing use of chemicals has disrupted these complex relationships. And this has led to, in many cases, dead soil, loss of soil. And I think if we ignore what's happening in the soil, we're going to accelerate its demise and ultimately struggle to feed ourselves in the long run. I don't think there's a huge amount of doubt about that amongst different perspectives on this issue. I think we also need to remember that soil is the greatest terrestrial store of carbon, and the fact that we have some control over it, unlike the oceans, despite the fact that they're a larger store, and that ultimately protecting this soil and rebuilding it is going to be essential for our future food production and also approach to biodiversity and climate change. And I suppose in my article, I talk very specifically about pasture or kind of species-rich grasslands. And these have historically been habitats that have evolved incredibly deep soils, locking away carbon. And this has come about from natural grazing regimes and I suppose the absence of cultivation. And it's been since cultivation that pastures have also played an important resting state or resting phase for the land between these cultivations and to restore fertility. And the key point I'm really trying to make here is that in our current predicament, and all the threats that we've been talking about in the future to our food production and to climate and biodiversity, about the fact that pastures offer a way to produce food without the need for fossil fuel inputs, just using sunlight, plants, water, and what you might call the magical organ, the rumen. These habitats tend to exist on marginal land, areas that aren't suited to high intensity food production anyway. And they do this alongside delivering a multitude of other public goods, whether it's water storage, carbon capture, and many others. And I think for this reason, and for the purposes of food security or food sovereignty, I think pasture and the role it plays should really be thought of as a strategic asset. I think it's something vital that we need to protect. And frankly, I'm staggered by how often people propose solutions to climate change that involve the burning of more fossil fuels.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're going to move on from that in a second, because there's a question sort of leading on from where you got to, but there was a question in the chat about where the article was that you were mentioning that Reggie had written. And so I just want to sort of remind everybody that it's in the report that's come out today from the Food and Global Security Network. It'll be live on our website after the webinar at foodandsecurity.net. And on there, you'll be able to find a link to the whole report, or if you scroll down, you'll be able to see individual links to individual PDFs for individual articles. So Jimmy, we're talking about soil as a strategic asset and the importance of maintaining it and getting people to recognize the importance of soil. And yet our soil biodiversity is already degraded, and mainstream agriculture is still so based on extraction rather than regeneration. So in your view, if we fail to take action now while we still can you see a situation where our food production falls and fails, where imports become significantly more expensive, and where this could lead to accelerating inequality and civil unrest?
I think there's always a danger of getting too deep into hypotheticals, but yes, I do think that conflict is a worst case scenario. I think there's a big geographic element to this. I think if you looked at the UK as an island, it's possible that the worst case scenario for us is perhaps heightened food inequality, perhaps some socio-political unrest. And I certainly think that's a future that we should not be entertaining, and we should be acting now in order to ensure that we don't get there. And I suppose I would come back to the fact that if things do get worse, we will need to look at our landscapes differently. we will need to try and find solutions, which I would use the term agroecology as a way of framing these solutions, ways in which we can get multiple outcomes out of our land, not just look at the land through a single lens. And I think, again, pasture should and hopefully will come into greater focus. And I think, to be clear, just because I'm sure we have a broad range of people watching this, I'm not suggesting that we don't plant trees, restore hedgerows, restore our peat bogs. I think what I am suggesting is that pasture should play this central role and its underlying soil. I think we need to be protecting the soil under pasture, not ploughing it up, because that's going to cause further problems. And I think also we need to reflect as a developed nation on the role that pasture, and particularly the livestock that live on it, play in other countries where perhaps the nutritional and economic role of those livestock is much greater. And I think, Reggie again talks brilliantly about this in his article.
Thank you very much for that. I'm struck by the nature-based solutions team at Oxford University talk in terms of a third of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere being able to be drawn down in regenerative systems into the soil. And so from that perspective, it is clearly a critical asset. It is clearly something that we should be promoting and learning how to work with as well as we possibly can, in addition, as you say, to peat bogs and trees and all the other things which are routinely talked about by people within this space. Reggie, you said that as a child, you talk in your article about this, about the way that we shouldn't work with nature. We shouldn't see ourselves that we are working with nature. Rather, we are nature. We're part of nature ourselves. What does that mean in practical terms?
It's actually relatively simple. If you think of life on Earth is carbon-based, right? So we are life on Earth. We're not outside of Earth. We are here. We are part of the living systems of the planet. We are a carbon-based life form. And so we tend to, we develop this colonizing mentality where we are somehow separated from everything else. And because of that, everything is our disposal, from the air to fly planes in, all the way to the water to extract it for whatever it is that we want it for, and to pollute it as we wish, all of that. We tend to separate ourselves, and then as a result of that, really disconnect the direct consequences of all of this disruption that comes back to us. And I think in a way, we have done this because it puts us in a space where we can and then, we can come back and sort of, quote unquote, correct our mistakes without having to live from a perspective of a living system on the planet. We rather live as outsiders to those systems. And so from an indigenous mind and an indigenous perspective, we are simply carbon-based living systems that happen to have evolved alongside millions and millions of other life forms on this planet. In fact, we owe our own sophisticated, being to the fact that those other living systems also existed and evolved along with us. And to the extent that we don't see ourselves as part of that, we are actually justifying all of the behaviors that we are engaged in today that disrupt those systems at the very cost of our own existence. And that is what I mean by, we are nature. We were born of the elements of the earth. In fact, if you take a sample of leaves and twigs and soil and grasses, put it through the chemical analysis, you will find that the same elements are there as if you take a piece of a person and put it into an analysis like that. We don't understand that to the extent that we have to, that in order to decolonize the way we think about the world and the living systems. And so to the extent that we can adopt that more indigenous, and I mean indigenous as in accepting fully that we are simply part of the living systems of the earth, and that we cannot And we should not see ourselves above or in any way superior to the grasshopper, to the microorganisms of the soil. In fact, when we think of ourselves, when I say we are nature, you can actually scientifically prove it. If you think of it, we're not individuals. We think of ourselves like that because we want to separate ourselves. But if you really look at what we are made out of, the trillions of cells, the billions of bacteria and viruses, and all of this that supports us, the crust that keeps us, the biological defenses, all of that, it's trillions of organisms that form the human being. We are nature from that perspective. If we could actually put colors into that, we will look and then put colors on us based on the commonalities that we have with every other living system on Earth, and then we merge ourselves. You couldn't find a human being because he will be identical to everything else, because we are simply living forms.
Thank you so much. Now, Chantal, when you hear Reggie talking about the need to be indigenous with the earth as he did then, does that feel familiar to you in terms of what IPES Food refers to as the long food movement?
Yes, absolutely. And I think maybe to backtrack a little bit, so this long food movement that we referred to in our article is a bit of a play on words coming out of IPES Food's latest report. And really what we mean here is to refer to the collective activities and strategies that really need to be undertaken together by those working to transform food systems. So rather than constantly focusing on short-term priorities, on immediate gains, we really need to start thinking long-term and to collaborate across sectors, across levels of action, and to reconcile differences really to, as I said before, rebalance power in the food systems and to motivate change. And so I think this movement refers to the collaborative visioning that we need to do to move towards sustainability and really hopefully encourage governments and other actors to act in accordance. I'm mindful actually that Reggie mentioned he's always hesitant to use the word movement. He said this before we started the call when referring to what we're all a part of. But I think, if we can create permanence, if we can create strategy and organization to our respective strategies, we could really go a long way. And so for me, Indigenous knowledge, the ability to work, with the earth is really crucial to that movement and that vision. I think briefly, if I can, in our report, we identified 2 scenarios of what food systems could look like by 2045. And in the first case, which I won't dwell on, we really projected into what would happen if we followed a business as usual scenario. We can sort of imagine what happens there. But then more relevant to this question is we imagined what would happen if instead, this food movement came together to tackle the many food-related crises that we've been dealing with. And I think at the heart of that second scenario is very much this paradigm shift rooted in people in the earth, in types of knowledge that we just haven't been privileging thus far. And so I think part of that vision is rooted in agroecology, food sovereignty, concepts that rely on indigenous and experiential knowledge, on synergies and diversity to create resilience. And again, this is such a major contrast to the path that we're going down now. That's really rooted in this uniformization of societies, of landscapes, and of just ways of thinking. And we know this paradigm is one that has the capacity to meet the multiple dimensions of sustainability. The thing is, while things like agroecology are being recognized by major international institutions, we're still seeing these growing pains in terms of how agroecology and these types of concepts are actually being supported in practice by policymakers. But in practice, again, we're seeing how Indigenous peoples, small-scale producers, rural communities, these are really some of the people that have been fundamental in safeguarding biodiversity, soil health, ecosystems. And we have more and more documented examples now of how these practices and ways of thinking are bringing us closer to sustainability. So at this point, it's really just about bringing these to light and making sure we're acting in accordance with them and not against them.
Thanks so much. I love the way that you talk about the long food movement, not just as a vision, but as a whole system strategy, as the beginning of a whole system strategy, and that we are all, through what we're doing here, part of a movement for change. And I think that's absolutely right. Thank you. Reggie, people talk about indigenous farming or regenerative farming not being scalable. And they say that we can't feed the world through agroecology, through these regenerative approaches. Now, in your article, you say that it's not the physical transition of the land that's currently unscalable, but instead the mental and economic and structural shift that's required in order to establish Indigenous-centered stewardship, which I guess touches very much on what Chantal was just talking about there. Is that what you mean? What do you mean?
Yes, and here's something that we just got to understand. One, the Earth operated at a global ecospherical level of scale before we came in and started to create this fantasy world where we can actually control everything. So just keep that in mind for the purpose of establishing what scale actually means and what is possible within the Earth's ecosphere. So I would say that the only scale beyond which these ancestral systems are not possible is beyond the Earth itself. That is the only limit we got. Now, maybe I don't, well, Amazon CEO and all these folks bring some of this to Mars or something else, but that will be another story. The thing is that when we talk about, and Chantal was very eloquent about putting this in the context of indigenous peoples, I would say native peoples who continue to live according to indigenous principles. Let's make that differentiation. Have preserved at the planetary level, and this is well documented, like as she said, over 80% of the total biodiversity that is still stays on Earth. This is done in less than 20% of the total land mass, and by a population of no more than, I believe, 370 million people in total that have been brutalized for many hundreds of years, driven to the brink of extermination, suffer genocide, all of these conditions, and yet their practices were continuing to be applied at a magnificent scale despite all of that. Now, we came into this space where in the case of the United States, the whole continental US, remember, was managed according to principles like indigenous principles for many thousands, not hundreds, like in the recent revolution, Green Revolution, but tens of thousands of years at a large scale. This is not, we're not talking about theoreticals here. The plains were managed, the buffalo was managed. This was not, pristine, untouched territory that the colonists came to find. So absolutely, not only do we know how to do it, there is plenty of evidence, and we can dig up the rest of the scientific evidence we need to restore those systems that produce energy or transformed energy at a much larger scale than the current linear ways of monopolizing and monocultures and so on. So bottom line is this: what we have is a colonizing system that has framed us from childhood all the way to adulthood to think in a certain way, including to think that the only thing that is possible is the system that dominates today. And that is the most important mental, physical, and spiritual blockade that is keeping us from actually operating at the ecospherical scale in a way that is more responsible, that actually regenerates the ecosystems on which we depend for our food, instead of justifying to ourselves that the only way that we can do this is by extracting, exploiting, and actually degenerating and destroying the very foundation on which food production depends, which is the ecosystems of the planet. So the practices associated with that, I mean, we have done tons of work that I even participated in this UN document where we collected a lot of these practices that are still being, can be learned from the communities. Also, Andrew Liu, former president of IFOAM, just finished his most recent publication with a lot of these practices as well. So anyway, bottom line is not the sky what's the limit, it's the ecosphere, the only limit we have.
Thanks so much, Reggie. And of course, within your article, you talk about poultry, and you use poultry as a very practical living example. And so if people want to see an example beyond that of what you can do and how you can scale the poultry industry, for example, then you describe that beautifully. We're going to try and finish the discussion in the next 5 minutes or so we get time for at least 1 or 2 questions. But Chantal, I wonder how, we haven't touched on diet yet, and I wonder how important a change in diet is, for example, to better meat and dairy, more diversity, less processed food, to your vision of agroecology.
Sure, thanks. And firstly, thanks so much for that, Reggie. I think I'm seeing it in the comments of the chat, but no one could have said that better. I think really diversity was the key word of that question that you just asked. And I think, as it is for most questions related to food system sustainability, resilience of diets, of ecosystems, of societies can really only be built through a diversity of crops, of landscapes, of dietary habits, of cultures. And I think we know that current dietary trends are not sustainable, not just because of what we're eating, but how we produce those foods. And that's actually whether we're talking about plant or animal products. We rely on so few crops, so few animal species to constitute our diets. These come from long, opaque, unsustainable supply chains. They're processed into these very calorie dense but nutrient poor products. So, certainly our diets need to be rethought. But that being said, I might disappoint you a little bit because I always bristle when I hear the expression change in diets. Because I think, firstly, it's an expression that's often used to further this belief that it's up to individuals or up to certainly the consumer to lead food systems change, rather than it being the responsibility of governments, of corporations to build and support the healthier structures that we need, the healthier food systems. So it kind of sort of implies that it's on us as individuals to be making the right choices, which is a bit problematic for me, but also because, we know it's not everyone that necessarily needs to undergo a change in diet. Again, we know which system, we know which logic, we know which practices are the culprits for where we're at today. So, we're not looking for this universal change in diets, but for a change in dominant food system practices, of which diets are obviously a part. So I think, again, briefly, agroecology is, again, and I'm hammering this a number of times, agroecology is synonymous with healthy, more nutritious and diverse diets. Reggie was mentioning this earlier. We have so many examples of communities with greater dietary diversity able to sustain access to foods throughout the year. They don't have to suffer from hunger and malnutrition during lean seasons because of diversity in the community. So, I think we have tons of examples of how agroecology can help in this regard. Of course, we then have to consider the access point and the types of distribution systems that would need to be put in place for these types of products to be available to everyone. I'm seeing a lot of points in the comments about urban poverty and ensuring that all communities have access to these kinds of foods.
Yeah, absolutely. That was exactly what I was just scribbling about, was the notes in the chat there. But yeah, diversity, as you say, so critical, not just in terms of the nutrition that people have access to, but the food systems, the way that food is produced, but also the distribution of food as well. Neil, I just want to sort of bring us to the end, and I've got one last question. It's quite a long question, but bear with me if you will. If we were to reach 2 degrees, which, as I say, it feels like it's increasingly likely as we move up to COP at the moment, and whether we get there by 2040, 2050, 2060 or whenever, we're going to face even more extreme weather impacts and potentially severe disruption to harvest. And of course, those impacts won't just be felt in Europe, but around the world. And at the moment, if one country, Britain, for example, has a bad harvest, we can import food. And there's not much of a problem. But in that situation where we're seeing climate impacts and biodiversity impacts at a global level, we won't just be able to import food because there'll be competition for those staple ingredients around the world. And so potentially prices rise with potentially devastating impacts on people who are already living in poverty or are living close to poverty. So what, and of course, that's the nexus, that's the crux of what we've been talking about for the last hour. What do you think today's politicians and strategic planners should be doing to address this threat?
Oh, nice short question to finish. Thank you, Finlay. You've obviously not been talking to the local farmers around you and I, because I think the harvests are getting disrupted already by extreme weather events. But the reality is, and fellow panelists have talked about it, and a lot of it's in the chat. In the last century, twice we worried about food security or food sovereignty. Both times it was a period of conflict and just after. But subsequently, we've become much more blasé. And as someone said, where does food come from? Supermarkets. Milk, cows? No, the fridge in the supermarket. The same with meat and other things. It's not unique to food. It applies to other commodities and other resources. But we've got to try and take a strategic perspective on this one. And that's challenging because we're looking at a strategic issue that needs long-term thinking, long-term planning, And we live in a short-term tactical world where people are looking for much more immediacy. But if we're going to address this, we need to think long-term. We need to understand all the risks to our prosperity and well-being, the interrelationship between them, so we need that comprehensive analysis and a picture, and then we need to think about how we're going to do it. And it's not just governments or strategic planners. This is a whole of society responsibility. We've got to break down some of Jimmy's silos, both within government and between government, the commercial and business sector, and individuals. We all have responsibility in this as well. But at the end of the day, we need to be looking for healthier people. If we've got healthier people, they're probably going to be better educated people, therefore probably going to be more productive people, and we're probably going to have a more prosperous society in the process. And we've got to try and address these points. So the government's going to set up the framework, but then it's going to require all of us, whether it be at a local level, a national level, a regional or global level. And one size will not fit all, but there are lessons we can learn and share amongst communities in different parts of the world to try and address these issues. We've got to take care because it's complex. We've got to think about, action we take on food, better be careful it doesn't exacerbate issues of climate change or increase the risk of conflict and vice versa. So there's that sort of approach. But I think what we're trying to achieve is not just secure and affordable food supplies, but secure, affordable and sustainable food supplies that will allow us to address some of the issues that we've talked about today. And that strategy must also focus on those areas where people are currently less able to help themselves, whether it's in developed societies in the poorer communities or it's in less developed societies where the country is already experiencing many challenges and risks which are impacting on the resilience and ability to governments to look after their citizens.
Thanks so much for that. I'm chastened by the thought that you had there that, over the last century, there have been those two specific moments in human history where people have been really fixed on food security and what that means for them. And of course, what we're talking about today and, what we're hoping to focus on in the work of the Food and Global Security Network as we go forward is very much around that. We need to focus on this now before we get to that point of conflict. We need to focus on food security in a way that hasn't perhaps happened before those two big wars, in order to make sure that together at a global level, we're able to mitigate some of those threats and stave off that level of conflict in the future, particularly where food is an accelerant of that level of instability. Thanks so much. That's all we have time for in terms of the discussion. We've got a lot of questions, and I'm afraid we've only got 5 minutes or so to get through them. There's one question here that I'm not going to ask the panel, which is what would be a better measure of land productivity than tons of product? And I'm going to ask you to go to the report and look at the article by Dr. Ashley Bright, because she goes into quite a lot of detail on this around nature-based solutions and the global farm metric from the Sustainable Food Trust that many of us here will have been involved in working on. Here's a question which is the emerging market for carbon offsetting, and I think the question's about the UK, but let's try and think about it more globally. The emerging market for carbon offsetting and Treasury investment in stimulating natural capital solutions, is that in itself a threat to food security in the UK or elsewhere? So is carbon offsetting and Treasury investment in carbon offsetting, is that a threat to food security? Who'd like to have a go at that? Jimmy?
Yes, I'd love to. I think it is a risk to food security. I think it's evidence of looking at this broad problem that we've been discussing through a very narrow lens. We actually have a report out tomorrow with a few other organisations, the Soil Association, Sustainable Food Trust, picking up some of the things that have come out of the Climate Change Committee's recent 6th carbon budget, and the fact that it's kind of suggesting planting huge amounts of trees on pastures without too much thought, producing bioenergy crops again on pastures. And I think there's an inherent market risk that if you prioritize one narrow solution over others, that you end up creating these sorts of market mechanisms that encourage people to buy land, to plant trees, to get the offset, and I think that's a dangerous path to go down.
Thanks very much indeed. There's a question, I think, for Reggie, because I suspect that you have quite a lot of direct experience around this. And we'll see if we can fit possibly one more question in after this. How do we ensure healthy and sustainable food is accessible for the growing urban poor. Most of us live in towns or cities these days. Chantal touched on it earlier, but how do we make sure that regenerative agriculture, that sustainability can feed the urban poor as well?
There is a lot of angles. We talked about price. We talked about all kinds of different aspects of food. One thing we understand is that there is no such thing as cheap food. We can cheapen the access to food, but as we cheapen it, we make it extremely more expensive, and then we need to subsidize those systems in order to sustain them. So at the end, we still pay the higher price that a food is actually reflective of. So one of the things we know is that this community-based restructuring, literally decolonizing the supply chain infrastructure. So access, affordability, and reintegration of communities, those that are in the business of producing food and those who are in other businesses and are not necessarily producing their food, the bringing together of these different sectors requires that we restructure the supply chain, especially, and this is what we are targeting, we are focusing now, especially ownership, control, and governance. That is where the decisions are made. That part of the supply chain is what determines how the land is managed, how farmers and workers are treated and compensated, and as a result of that, how they re-engage the natural systems of the earth or not. And back to the carbon question, I mean, obviously carbon, there's too much of it in the air, and we need to bring it back down. But this idea that we can turn it into a marketplace is simply an opportunity to capitalize on a problem rather than looking at the causes of it and trying to solve the root causes, which, by the way, is the foundation of food insecurity and lack of food access in the first place. The core causes of all of these issues that we are seeing is grounded on the infrastructure that we have built for the purpose of extraction of wealth and capitalizing on the problems that we create as a way to extract more public wealth through taxpayers' money to subsidize the so-called solutions to the very problems that we caused. As long as we stay in that cycle, we're not going to solve this issue of access to food and the interrelation between those communities in the urban areas and those in the rural areas. Here in Minnesota, we are rebuilding some of that supply chain already. We are partnering with urban communities so that we can have, eliminate when possible the middle steps that make food more expensive unnecessarily because it doesn't add value in any way. The value of the food is already defined the minute it leaves the farm. No more nutrition is going to be added. In fact, we can only decrease the quality the more we process, the more we handle it, and the more expensive it gets. That's where some of the solutions are, but we need to reorganize how we do this, and we've got to do it at scale. And that's where we are trying to rebuild this in the energy again.
Thanks so much, Reggie. I think we are out of time, actually. So I'm just going to kind of sum up a little bit here. There are lots of issues and questions and discussions also that have been taking place in the text, and we'll go through them afterwards. And if there are things that we feel that we need to get in touch with people about, we will do. The other thing is just to say, because this has been such an interesting discussion, and because our report and the Food and Global Security Network is new, I wonder, if people feel that they've been inspired and excited and interested by the conversation that we've had today, please do feel free to get in touch. So that you can potentially work with us or get involved in what we're doing as we go forward. But that really is all we've got time for. It's been a fascinating hour, and thanks so much to the panelists for their time. Through the report we've launched today, we urge governments to take the security risks associated with soil degradation and ecological breakdown extremely seriously. And as Chantal said, we offer agroecology as a low risk and low cost solution that can help to mitigate the security threats associated and connected with poor and degrading soil health. So climate, biodiversity, and food, not dealt with singly, but together. That's how we should be moving forward. And I urge you to take time to visit the Food and Global Security Network website, which is www.foodandsecurity.net, and to download our report and the individual articles. And you're going to find the Farmgate podcast, which I host and which is going to address these issues in more detail in due course. at faifarms.com/podcasts, or whichever podcast channel you use to get your podcast from. So that's the Farmgate podcast. I'd like to thank our panelists, Rear Admiral Neil Morissetti, Chantal Clement, Reginaldo Hazlitt Marroquin, and Jimmy Woodrow. And finally, thank you to you, wherever you are in the world this afternoon, for taking the time to be with us. I've been Finlo Costain from the Food and Global Security Network. Thank you and goodbye for now.